August 2nd, 1492. On the same exact morning that Christopher Columbus sets sail from Spain, chasing a new world, hundreds of thousands of Jewish families are being pushed onto ships in the other direction. They are not exploring. They are running. The Spanish crown has just signed an order called the Alhambra Decree: convert to Christianity or leave. Anyone who stays and refuses faces death. These people are called the Sephardic Jews. They had lived in Spain for over 1,500 years. They built schools, hospitals, libraries. They translated ancient Arabic and Greek texts into Latin, texts that literally gave birth to European science and medicine. They were not strangers in Spain. They were part of its foundation, and in a single summer, they were erased, or so the crown believed. Because 530 years later, in a genetics lab in Tel Aviv, a scientist is staring at a DNA result on his screen, and what he's looking at should not exist. He is looking at the genome of a man from a small Spanish town whose family has been Catholic for 5 centuries, and buried deep inside his DNA, clear as a fingerprint, is the unmistakable genetic signature of Sephardic Jewish ancestry. In 2008, a study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics tested 1,140 men across Spain and Portugal. The result? Almost 1 in 5 carried Sephardic Jewish ancestry in their Y chromosome, 1 in 5. In a country that officially expelled every single Jewish person more than 5 centuries ago. The fire didn't work, the exile didn't work. So 500 years of forced forgetting didn't work. So the question is, how? If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe right now, because this story gets stranger with every single minute. And before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your country in the comments below and tell me, have you ever done a DNA ancestry test? What did it show you? Because by the end of this video, you might want to order one. Because stories like this one are showing up in living rooms all around the world. Now, to understand how this DNA survived, we have to go back. Not 500 years, not 1,000 years. We have to go back 3,000 years. To a civilization so advanced, so deeply woven into the ancient world, that even modern science is still catching up with what they left behind. Most people think the story of Jews in Spain begins in 1492, the expulsion, the fire, the ships. But that's actually the end of the story. The beginning goes back to at least the 6th century BCE, before Christianity existed, before Islam existed, before the Roman Empire had even fully formed. Jewish communities were already established on the Iberian Peninsula, the land the Romans would later call Hispania, and the land that Jewish people called Sepharad, a name taken directly from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Obadiah. They weren't migrants who arrived and stayed. They became part of the land itself. Then came the era that historians still call extraordinary. Between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries, whilst Islamic rulers controlled most of Spain, and under this rule something rare happened. Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived together in the same cities. Not always perfectly, not without tension, but they built something together. Jewish scholars worked as court physicians. They served as diplomats. A man named Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a 10th century Jewish doctor and statesman, served the Islamic Caliph of Cordoba directly. He translated Greek medical texts into Latin. He connected the Islamic intellectual world with Christian Europe. Without people like him, the scientific and philosophical knowledge that sparked the European Renaissance might never have crossed the Mediterranean at all. This was the golden age of Sepharad. And by the year 1000 CE, Spain had the largest, most intellectually developed Jewish civilization on earth. They weren't on the edges of society, they were at its center. But here's the thing about golden ages. They always carry the seeds of their own destruction. Because while this civilization was at its peak, Christian kingdoms in northern Spain were pushing south. Religious nationalism was growing, and a fault line was forming beneath the surface of this golden world. And when that fault line broke, it didn't break slowly. It exploded, with fire, with forced baptisms, with neighbors turning on neighbors. And it happened not in 1492, but a full century earlier, in a wave of violence so sudden and so brutal that it would change the DNA of an entire civilization, literally. The year is 1391. A preacher named Ferron Martinez begins moving through the cities of Castile and Aragon, while delivering sermons that call for the destruction of Jewish communities, and people listen. Within months, pogroms, organized violent attacks, sweep across Spain. Jewish neighborhoods are burned, thousands are killed. And for those left standing, the choice is simple: convert to Christianity or die. Tens of thousands of Jewish people convert, not out of belief, but out of terror. Overnight, they become what historians call conversos, or new Christians, and this creates one of the most psychologically haunted populations in human history. On the outside, Christian, going to church, baptizing their children, saying the right prayers in public. On the inside, carrying a private identity they cannot speak out loud, but the persecution doesn't stop. Because in 1478, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition. And here is the terrifying twist. The Inquisition is not targeting practicing Jews. There are no openly practicing Jews left. It is targeting the conversos, the people who already converted. Its logic goes like this. You can change a man's religion, but you cannot change his blood. This is the moment a concept called limpieza de sangre, blood purity, enters European law. Having Jewish ancestry, even as a third-generation Christian, becomes a crime. And now, here is the detail that should stop you completely. The man who runs the Inquisition, who personally oversees the torture and execution of thousands, is a man named Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain. Historians believe Torquemada's own grandmother was a Jewish converso. The most feared hunter of Jewish blood in history carried it himself. And while all of this is happening, in the stone houses of Toledo and Córdoba and Seville, families are doing something quiet and dangerous. A woman lights a tiny candle inside a clay pot, turned toward the wall so the light won't show through the window. She whispers a Hebrew blessing her mother taught her. Her children are in the next room. She will never teach them this prayer out loud, but something will carry it forward, not memory, not words, DNA, because that exact woman, or someone just like her, has living descendants today, in places she could never have imagined. And one of those places is a high desert in the American Southwest, where Catholic families have been lighting candles on Friday nights for 500 years and never knew why. July 31st, 1492, the deadline. Every Jew still in Spain must be gone by sundown. Now, historians estimate that somewhere between 40,000 and 250,000 people board ships that summer. The range is wide because records were poorly kept, and many were destroyed. Some researchers cite first-hand Italian eyewitness accounts that estimated around 50,000 families, roughly 250,000 individuals, Sephardic studies +1. They scatter across the known world. Some go to North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, some to the Netherlands, some to Italy. Many go to the Ottoman Empire, whose Sultan Bayezid II reportedly looks at what Spain has done and says something close to. Ferdinand is considered a wise king, yet he impoverishes his own country to enrich mine. The Ottoman Empire, what is today Turkey and surrounding regions, opens its doors. Sephardic Jewish scholars, physicians, merchants, and craftsmen pour into Istanbul and Thessaloniki and Izmir. They bring their skills, their networks, and their language. And that language, that is something extraordinary. The Sephardic Jews carry their 15th century Castilian Spanish with them into the Ottoman world, and it freezes. While Spanish evolves in Spain over the next 500 years, the Sephardic communities in Istanbul are still singing songs and saying prayers in a dialect of medieval Spanish called Ladino, preserving words and sounds that have completely vanished from the Iberian Peninsula itself. A living time capsule, a voice from 1492 still speaking. But that's not the most striking thing they carry. They carry keys, iron keys, heavy old-fashioned keys to their houses and shops back in Spain. And these families pass those keys from parent to child, generation after generation, for over 400 years, as a promise. One day, we will go home. One day, we will open that door again. 23 generations of a family, holding the same key to a home that no longer exists. And now, here is where the science enters. Because this diaspora, this explosion of people across 3 continents, is traceable in DNA. A 2020 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics analyzed the genomes of nearly 3,000 individuals across all major Jewish communities. It found that Sephardic Jews form a distinct, identifiable genetic population, clearly separate from other Jewish groups, yet all sharing the same core ancestral signal from the ancient Middle East. Every ship that left Spain in 1492 left a genetic trail. Wherein we can follow it. But some of those ships didn't go east. Some went west, into the Americas. And the people on those ships buried their identity so deeply, so completely, that even their own great-great-great-grandchildren forgot it entirely, until now. Here is a fact that almost no mainstream history class teaches. When Spain began conquering the Americas in the early 1500s, many conversos, those secret Jewish Christian families, joined the expeditions, not out of greed for gold, but because the New World, thousands of miles from Spain, offered something the Inquisition could never fully reach: distance. In the borderlands of northern Mexico and what is now New Mexico, some of these families settled, permanently, away from cities, away from the church's watchful eye, in the high desert where nobody was checking. And something remarkable happened. Isolated from both Judaism and full assimilation, these families passed down fragments of Jewish practice, not as religion, just as what our family does. Don't eat pork. Light a small candle on Friday night. Bury the dead quickly. Wash your hands before eating. Circumcise your sons. Nobody knew why. It was just tradition. Then, in the 1980s, a historian named Dr. Stanley Hordes became the state historian of New Mexico, and people started walking into his office. Hispanic Catholic families, deeply Christian, some of them, describing the same customs, over and over again, from completely different towns and families who had no connection to each other. Hordes spent years documenting these testimonies. He eventually published his findings in a book called To the End of the Earth, published by Columbia University Press in 2005. His conclusion: these were the descendants of Sephardic conversos who had come north from colonial Mexico. But testimonies alone weren't proof. The proof came from genetics. When DNA testing reached these communities, researchers found something stunning. Families with no memory of Jewish heritage testing positive for the Cohen modal haplotype, that is the Y chromosome marker associated with the Kohanim, the ancient Jewish priestly class. A marker that genetic studies have traced back roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years. Think about what that means. A man in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Catholic, Spanish surname. His family has gone to church every Sunday for as long as any of them can remember. And his DNA says your direct paternal line traces to the ancient Jewish priests of the Levant. The Yale Historical Review, reviewing this research in 2020, wrote that DNA has confirmed that converso descendants are indeed among the ancestors of people living in Latin America and the American Southwest today. And this is not one family, not two. Researchers estimate somewhere between 10 and 15% of men in parts of New Mexico, South Texas, and northern Mexico carry Y chromosomes with Middle Eastern, not European, origins. These people did not know. Their grandparents did not know. Their great-grandparents did not know. The secret was so completely buried that it survived only in two places: in small, unexplained family rituals, and in their DNA. Now, let's go back to Spain itself. Because while descendants were being discovered in the deserts of New Mexico, geneticists were uncovering something even more uncomfortable inside Spain's own population. In 2008, researchers published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics that tested Y chromosomes from men in towns and villages across Spain and Portugal. The goal was straightforward: map the genetic ancestry of the modern Iberian Peninsula. What they found embarrassed 500 years of Spanish national identity. Approximately 20% of modern Spanish and Portuguese men carry Sephardic Jewish ancestry in their Y chromosomes, and another roughly 11% carry Moorish, North African Muslim ancestry. Combined, nearly 1/3 of men on the Iberian Peninsula descend from the very groups the Crown claimed to have completely removed. So the Inquisition ran for 3.5 centuries. It had the power of the church, the state, and the military behind it, and it still couldn't erase the genomes of the people it persecuted. Why? Because the Y chromosome passes directly from father to son, unchanged. So the percentage of Sephardic ancestry visible in Spanish men today is essentially the same as it was right after 1492. Hundreds of thousands of conversos stayed, lived as Christians, had children, and their descendants are walking around Spain right now, going to Mass, celebrating Christmas, with no idea that their direct paternal line traces back to the same families who boarded ships in that harbor. When Spain finally confronted this history, it did something remarkable. In 2015, when the Spanish government passed a law offering citizenship to proven descendants of the Sephardic Jews expelled in 1492, a formal act of national apology. The response was overwhelming. Over 130,000 applications arrived from Israel, from Turkey, from Argentina, from the United States. Some families came with documents going back generations, some came with DNA results, and some came with something else, something carried in their families for 5 centuries, iron keys to houses that no longer exist. And here's the number that puts the full scale of this into perspective. A 2014 study published in PLOS One calculated that given 20 generations since 1492 and the population sizes of that era, made the vast majority of all living Jewish people worldwide, not just Sephardic, likely have at least one direct genealogical connection to the Jews who were expelled from Spain. The expulsion didn't erase a people. It spread their DNA across the entire world. But the Spain story and the New Mexico story, they're only part of this. Because while these discoveries were happening in the West, in the East, the Sephardic world had already suffered a second catastrophe, one that nearly completed what the Inquisition had started. After 1492, the greatest Sephardic city in the world was not in Israel. It was not in North Africa. It was in Greece. Thessaloniki, a port city on the Aegean Sea, became home to the largest Sephardic Jewish community on earth. And for 400 years, these descendants of the Spanish exile turned that city into something extraordinary. By the early 20th century, Sephardic Jews were the majority population of Thessaloniki. The language of the port and the marketplace was Ladino, 15th century Spanish, carried from Granada and Seville across the Mediterranean. The city had over 30 synagogues. It had Ladino language newspapers. It had poets, rabbis, merchants, and doctors, all descendants of people who had boarded ships in Spain and rebuilt their entire world somewhere new. People called Thessaloniki the Jerusalem of the Balkans. And then the 20th century arrived. In 1917, a massive fire destroyed much of the Jewish quarter. Greek nationalism in the 1920s began pushing minority communities to the edges of public life. And then, in 1941, the Nazis occupied Greece. Well, what happened next is one of the most complete acts of cultural destruction in the modern era. Between March and August of 1943, the SS deported over 45,000 Jews from Thessaloniki in 18 trains, directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Upon arrival, the Nazis murdered nearly 34,000 of them by poison gas immediately. The rest were worked to death. The Wikipedia entry on the history of the Jews in Thessaloniki states that the majority of the community's 72,000 members were murdered in the camps. Today, only about 1,200 Jews remain in the city, but the Nazis didn't just kill the people, they destroyed the memory. The ancient Jewish cemetery of Thessaloniki, one of the largest in Europe, containing grave markers going back to 1492, shout to the very first generation of exiles from Spain, was demolished. The tombstones were ground into rubble. The rubble was used as building material. Roads were paved with it. Buildings were constructed from it. The graves of people who had survived the Spanish Inquisition ground into road material in Nazi-occupied Greece. 2 genocides, 500 years apart. 1 people. And yet, and this is the part that science could not have predicted, the genocide left a trace. Not just in history, not just in memory, in the genome. When a population is violently reduced, when a community of tens of thousands is brought down to a few hundred survivors in a single year, the genomes of those survivors show something scientists call a genetic bottleneck. Genetic diversity drops dramatically. Certain rare markers become concentrated, which then the population that rebuilds from those survivors carries an unusually distinct, unusually consistent genetic signature. In other words, the Holocaust, as monstrous as it was, made the genetic fingerprint of the surviving Sephardic population clearer, more traceable, not erased, sharpened. In 2010, Dr. Harry Oster, a geneticist at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, published what became one of the most significant studies in the history of Jewish genetics. The study was called Abraham's Children in the Genome Era. His team analyzed 160,000 genetic markers from individuals across 7 major Jewish diaspora communities: Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Italian, Turkish, Greek, and Ashkenazi Jews. Einstein Med +1. The result was striking. Jewish populations from 3 completely different geographic regions, separated by continents and centuries, were more genetically similar to each other than to the non-Jewish neighbors they had lived alongside for generations. 2,000 years of living in different countries, speaking different languages, eating different foods, and the DNA still clustered together. Oster said it directly. The study supports the idea of a Jewish people linked by a shared genetic history, yet the admixture with European people explains why so many Jews look like their non-Jewish neighbors. Now here is the philosophical twist that should sit with you for a moment. The same genetic isolation that persecutors through history pointed to and used to justify violence, to label Jews as permanently other, is also the exact biological mechanism that preserved the genetic integrity of this lineage across millennia. Persecution and survival are encoded in the same double helix. You cannot have one without the other. But Oster's finding opened an even deeper question. If this genetic thread survived 2,000 years of diaspora, if it survived the Inquisition, forced conversion, and the Holocaust, where does it actually come from? Who were the people at the very beginning of this chain? And the answer, discovered in Bronze Age graves in the ancient Middle East, is the biggest plot twist in this entire story. In 2020, an international team of archaeologists and geneticists published a landmark study in the journal Cell. Only they had extracted DNA from the bones of 73 individuals buried over 1,500 years at 5 archaeological sites across Israel and Jordan. These were the graves of the ancient Canaanites, the Bronze Age civilization that lived in the Levant more than 3,000 years ago. The civilization that the Hebrew Bible describes as the original inhabitants of the Promised Land, the researchers compared this ancient DNA to the genomes of modern populations across the region. The findings were direct. Most of today's Jewish and Arabic-speaking populations in Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan get more than half of their ancestry from these ancient Canaanite people. Trust +1 Professor David Reich of Harvard University, one of the world's leading experts in ancient DNA, put it this way when speaking to Haaretz. This study suggests there is a deep genetic connection of many Jewish groups today across the diaspora and many Arab groups to this part of the world thousands of years ago. The Canaanites themselves, the study found, were a mixture of even older populations, early Natufian hunter-gatherers who had lived in the Levant for tens of thousands of years, combined with later migrants arriving from the Caucasus Mountains and the Iranian Plateau. The Sephardic genome is, in a very real sense, a layered archive of migrations stretching back to the Stone Age now connect the full chain. The Bronze Age Canaanites, more than 3,000 years ago, in the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Ancient Israelites emerge from that population. Those Israelites are eventually scattered by Babylonian conquest, then Roman conquest, into a diaspora that spreads across the ancient world. Sephardic Jewish communities form in Spain by at least the 6th century BCE, carrying that Levantine core in their genomes. They build a 1,500-year civilization in Iberia. They are expelled in 1492 and scatter again across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and the Americas. Their descendants survive the Holocaust, forced conversion, and 5 centuries of assimilation. And today, their DNA matches the ancient graves of Canaanites buried in Israel and Jordan 3,000 years ago. The people standing in Granada Harbor in 1492, some holding rusted iron keys, were carrying a genome that connected them in a measurable scientific way to the Bronze Age world that gave birth to their entire civilization. But here's the question that all of this science still cannot answer, and it's the most important one. In 2015, when Spain passed its law offering citizenship to descendants of expelled Sephardic Jews, 130,000 applications arrived. Some families came with old documents, genealogies traced back through Ottoman records, colonial archives, Portuguese church registries. Some came with DNA results from consumer ancestry tests, and some, literally, came with the keys. The iron keys that their ancestors had carried out of Spain in 1492, passed from generation to generation for over 500 years. Now, think about what that is. An object, when heavy and rusted, that has moved through 23 generations of human hands, through the streets of Thessaloniki and Istanbul, and Buenos Aires and Tel Aviv, through the Holocaust, through the fall of the Ottoman Empire, through 2 world wars, through everything, just waiting. But here is the quiet tragedy inside this story. Most of those 130,000 applicants had no living connection to Sephardic culture, no Ladino, no knowledge of the specific prayers or music or recipes or liturgical traditions that made Sephardic Jewish identity what it was for 5 centuries. Spain was offering citizenship to a genome, but the culture that gave that genome meaning was almost gone. Ladino, the language frozen in 1492, the language that preserved 15th century Spanish in the mouths of exiles for 500 years, is now critically endangered. Estimates put native speakers at around 60,000, with most of them over the age of 60. In Thessaloniki, once the largest Ladino-speaking city on Earth, only a handful of native speakers remain. Alliance +1, the genome survived. The language is dying. And somewhere in Tel Aviv right now, a young woman speaks Ladino into a recording device for a language preservation archive. She is singing a lullaby her grandmother taught her, in a dialect of Spanish that hasn't been heard on Spanish soil since 1492. The song is 534 years old, and the people it belongs to are still scattered across the world. The DNA survived the fire. The keys survived the exile. But survival is not the same as return. And here is the question that genetics cannot answer, that history cannot answer, that religion is still arguing about, when everything that made you who you are has been taken from you, the language, the land, the community, the memory, and only the biology remains. Are you still the same people? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think, and if this story moved you or surprised you, share it with one person, because this is the kind of history that deserves to be heard. Next time, the Ashkenazi DNA paradox, a population that emerged from medieval Europe but carries a genome pointing straight back to the ancient Middle East, with a genetic bottleneck so severe that scientists believe their entire population once passed through fewer than 350 individuals. Where did they really come from? And why does their DNA not match the history we've been taught? That story is coming.